Greetings. My name is Jonathan Sarna. I'm the director of the Schusterman Center for Israel Studies, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this latest installment of our Schusterman Center Scholars Seminar. With this week with Professor Shai Dromi, entitled "Recovering the Land: Jewish Israeli Settlers' Agricultural and Environmental Pursuits in the Israeli South." Professor Dromi is lecturer on sociology at Harvard University. He did his PhD in the same subject at Yale University. His research looks at how moral beliefs affect political and organizational dynamics. He has a recent book which you can obtain at a significant discount from the University of Chicago Press. It is entitled Above the Fray: The Red Cross and the Making of the Humanitarian NGO Sector. Um, Professor Dromi's also published and researched on the Israeli settler movement, and the withdrawal from Gaza. What we're going to hear is part of a new research dealing with settlers in the Israeli South. Three quick housekeeping notes. First, I'm going to ask everybody to please mute their microphones. Second, I'm going to ask you to put your questions in the chat. In approximately 40 minutes, Professor Alexander Kay, my colleague, will moderate a question and answer period. And finally, you will note that a live captioning is enabled. If you don't like live captioning, just go to the bottom of your screen on the right where it says live transcript and you can turn it off. Without further ado, it is a pleasure to welcome Professor Shai Dromi.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me, um, and for the very generous introduction. As the title of the talk suggests, I'm going to be talking about the Jewish Israeli settlers. And before getting started, I just wanted to say a couple additional words about my more general work. So, as Professor Sarna said, I'm a comparative historical sociologist. My main theoretical interest is really about how collective moral beliefs about right and wrong, good and bad, affect people's civic and political organizing. And my recent book that came out last year with the University of Chicago Press looks at how the international aid community, what we know today as humanitarian NGOs like Doctors Without Borders, like Oxfam, evolved in the 19th century. And what the book shows is that certain types of religious thinking about the need to separate charity from the state and have volunteers do anything that's charitable, everything that's humanitarian, created what we know today as an NGO organizational model, the type of organization that works primarily based on volunteers and donation. But today I'm going to talk about my research on the Jewish Israeli settlers, in particular on those who were relocated in Israel's withdrawal from Gaza. And I want to mention first two recent papers very briefly, and then I'll talk primarily about one current ongoing projects. But I'll just say in advance that COVID has altered some of my co-authors' plans to do archival work in the field, but we are certainly in the midst of research now, and we'll resume field work as soon as it becomes possible. And also, before I continue, I'd just like to acknowledge one of my co-authors who's here, Liron Sheniu, I believe joined us from Jerusalem, and he's an assistant professor of anthropology at the Hebrew University, and he's also a former postdoc fellow here at the Schusterman Center. So just to give a little bit of background, the so-called disengagement, which was the withdrawal of Israel from the Gaza Strip and from some areas of northern West Bank, was actually started rolling in 2003 with then Prime Minister Sharon announcing an intention to unilaterally withdraw, with the stated reasons of decreasing clashes between Israelis and Palestinians. This is 2003, so it's very much the height of the Second Intifada. Decreasing the amount of Palestinian population under Israeli administrative and civilian responsibility, and also alleviating concerns of a growing, de facto one-state solution, right? Where, like it or not, Israel is annexing de facto all the population in Gaza and in the West Bank. Now, this plan included the relocation of 9,000 settlers, a little bit more than 9,000 settlers in 25 settlements. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but in the top panel, these would be the white, townships marked in white text, and in the bottom panel, it would be the few in black font at the top. And these were all quite small settlements. Only 2 of them are more than 1,000 residents. They're not all religious, but religious Zionists that were prominent in their leadership and in their public representation. And of course, as one can expect, there was a heated public debate that involved protests, that involved struggle, sometimes even verging on violence. But at the end of the day, the disengagement did go as planned. And as Israeli sociologist Michael Feiga noted, the mainstream public, by and large, remained kind of an interested bystanders, very much expressing empathy or concern, but at the same time not taking action in order to stop it, as some of the settlers had expected. And then, of course, the settlers were relocated. Some of them were relocated to existing townships. Others were relocated into these sort of temporary housing, as we're seeing on the right, still in the vicinity of the Gaza Strip, but within the internationally recognized borders of Israel. Now, before continuing to talk about this, why should we care about settlers, and particularly this group? Well, first, I don't need to tell this group, but settlers have been extremely significant in Israeli politics, and even more so in Middle East sociopolitical processes. Much of the existing literature has actually focused more on the effects of the settlements on both on Israeli society and on Palestinian society. And or on the public statement, religious teachings, and organizational strategies that the settlers have taken. And we know less about their collective identity and experience, with the important exception of Feiga, who I mentioned, and several other sociologists and anthropologists. Now, knowing more about their collective identity and experience can teach us much, both about the stakes of relocating settlers, if such situations recur in the future, but also about possible acceptable solutions that at least some of the settlers will agree to, should there be a relocation. In addition, understanding more about the settlers' experience will tell us something about the sectors where settlers have been drawn to within the internationally recognized Israeli borders, as I'll talk about the agricultural sector, but there are others, primarily development. And this will also say something about more general Israeli society. And finally, beyond Israel, it'll help us think about other groups that are experiencing relocation and possibly gain insight into their experience and the stakes that this takes for them. Now, I know that we're an interdisciplinary group, so I won't talk too much about theory. I'd love to talk about this in the Q&A if anyone's interested. But just to say in a few words, I'm drawing on cultural sociological theory, in particular, the idea that groups are motivated by the need for self-worth and recognitions, and that groups' collective perception of themselves as morally worthy and morally superior helps them maintain a sense of worth, in particular when we're talking about adverse circumstances, right? So saying that we are actually, might not be as wealthy or as well off as some of our neighbors, but we are more caring and more morally righteous, is a way to also gain self-worth. And then, within this, individuals can actually use these cultural resources to evaluate and respond to social situations. Okay, and as I said, I would love to expand this more in the Q&A. Now, in one of my studies, I've looked at how what the stakes were for the disengagement for the settlers as they expressed themselves as plans for the settlement relocation were unfolding, in a sense that there was the time came to actually talk about compensation and what sort of compensation will be acceptable for them. And this was also an opportunity to hear from them what sort of meanings are they attaching to the disengagement. And within this, I've looked at the Parliamentary Finance Committee's proceedings where settlers were invited to just say basically what they would like to see as compensation, what they believe happened to them as part of the disengagement, and what, if anything, will resolve this. Right, so this is, and I was particularly interested in what settlers were saying is incommensurable, in the sense that it's not something that you can value as in money, that it's something that is particularly poignant to their experience. And as you could see that early, right, so of course there were conversations about the amount of the compensation and on the loss of community and cultural identity that the settlers felt they were experiencing in their, due to the disengagement. But more strikingly, there were demands to restore a positive relation with Israeli state and society. So in a sense, the settlers were saying, we are good citizens, we're worthwhile citizens, in a way we're the best citizens this country has. And instead of valuing us, you're basically tossing us out. Right, so for example, presenting themselves as standing at the heart of consensus, talking about themselves as salt of the earth, true Zionists, saying that former governments were not only agreed, but actually encouraged them to go there, saying that Rabin himself came to, give his blessing to their project, and presenting themselves really serving both the state and actually Israeli society by settling. This is something that's not only our project, but in a way it's everybody's project, that we are now being told by the state, no, you have to turn back. And they also mentioned various concrete forms of service that they were doing through settling, for example, providing jobs, creating factories in Gaza and the West Bank, serving, giving themselves to very generously to military service, serving in very dangerous areas in the military, et cetera, right? So in the sense of what they want from the state, right, you get these sort of statements. I don't want money, I want a commitment that if someone collapses, we'll know that they'll be taken care of. Or I want the bill to be fair, honest, embracing, supportive, even if it costs 101%, right? So in a way, so the expectation was that the state not only pay them, but actually restore them as the model citizens, and acknowledge what they themselves see as a complete tragedy, right? So in other words, the sense of contribution and power, public recognition is very central to the settlers' collective identity as they present, at least as they publicly present it, which makes the disengagement a harder blow because it signifies public rejection. But what became more interesting is post disengagement that relocated settlers started looking for other pursuits and take on other projects that they think represent a contribution to Israel, and that does not necessarily involve settling in Gaza and in the West Bank. Now, one example of this comes from a different study that I collaborated with Liron Shani on, which looked at the settlers' attempts to settle within the Green Line in a way that's similar to their Gaza settlements, but at the same time is not within the West Bank or Gaza, right? So immediately post disengagements, the settlers many settlers expressed an intention to settle again. And they were particularly drawn to a plan to build new townships in Lachish, which is a region in our kind of south central Israel. If you see on the mark on the map, it's kind of very, very close to the border with the West Bank. And the plan in general, the Israeli government plan was to fortify that boundary by sending people there to create settlements, to create small townships, and basically reinforce the border with a series of small townships that would also have people there that would do agriculture, that would build there, and in a way would help kind of observe the border and reduce infiltrations from one side to the other. Now, this area is not only a borderland, it's also a very important ecological corridor, which means that green activists in Israel were very much against the idea that anyone build townships there, settlers or not settlers, that this would destroy both the both natural beauty, but also the biodiversity in the area, and the various natural resources there, if a new settlement arises. So, and this became a topic for public debate. It reached the Supreme Court, which decided actually for the settlers, which means that by 2015, there were already 450 residents living in the small settlements there. Now, so Liron, my co-author, interviewed 34 settler leaders, farmers, organization members, and then also state officials and environmental activists. And we also looked at protocols and publications that had to do with establishing this area. And the really interesting thing to note is that settlers again are presenting themselves as doing something good for Israel, right? Very much drawn into this idea that they are, not just building a community for themselves, but doing something that's valuable, right? So this is one of the speakers. I'm green. I love the country. Green in the sense that I'm an environmental activist. I love the country. I'm part of the deal with establishing new settlements, also taking care of nature. This means also taking care of Zionism and keeping the vision alive, right? Now, interestingly, for settlers, building a new township there is actually an environmental project, in the sense that it not only does it not destroy local biodiversity, it's also a way to protect the land, to make sure that it's taken care of, to make sure that there are people around to take care of this. And it's actually oftentimes pitched against Bedouins and against Palestinians, right? So without a Jewish population here, nature will be harmed because the Bedouins don't ask for permission from you or me or anyone. They just do whatever they want and whenever and as much as they want to do with the land, right? So very much the sense that without that Jewish presence is somehow essential to caring, to grooming, to developing the land. And in that sense, they themselves say we're also taking on an environmental project. Yeah. Which leads us to another example, which comes from our Liron Shani and mine current research, which is about settlers taking an interest in agriculture in the Israeli South, and cultivating it is a project that makes them more central and more connected to the Israeli mainstream. So here we're looking at two groups in the Israeli South, which is in particular the Arava region down to the southeast. And we're looking at two kind of historically opposed groups, farmers who have been in southern Israel since the early, like the 50s, initially, even the late 40s. And then, of course, religious Zionist settlers who have started showing up in the Arava and seeking to get involved in the agricultural projects there. And they're in particular, they're building agricultural educational institutions there that are very much within the spirit of settlement, but at the same time oriented now toward the Arava as a new as a very significant territory for them. And this is relying on ongoing interviews and ethnography, on parliamentary records, on documents from the educational interviews in institutions in the Arava, and then also on media interviews with local activists from there. Now, just to give you a little bit of background on this specific region, so as you can see, it's a very, very arid part of Israel. It initially, this is the 1940s or 50s, it was acclaimed as exemplifying Zionist values of bringing bloom into the desert, right? This was absolutely kind of romanticized. And state encouraged migration begins in the 1950s through the 70s. And we start seeing these small agricultural communities, very small, doing very intensive forms of agriculture that actually is adapted to the hot climate and the scarce water supply. And these were predominantly non-observant Jews who went down there, and predominantly left-leaning, associated with the Labor Party, which predominated in the country at that time. And this was very much romanticized, even though these weren't lots of people. In 2015, we only have approximately 3,000 Jewish Israelis and an equal number of migrant workers who came down there. It was still historically very much a publicly celebrated project in Israeli culture. Nevertheless, the region has seen significant decline over the last several decades, both financially, but also in terms of public attention. There was, in general, a process of privatization that really created huge financial loss. The second and third generations simply did not stay and moved northward. So we're also, in terms of continuing the project, it was not sustainable. And as mentioned, multiple economic failures. Which means that also now the remaining agriculturalists in the South, who have been there like for several decades at this point, are trying to raise attention. They're saying that, you know, without agriculture, there is no Arava. Agriculture protects the borders of the country, et cetera, et cetera. So into this context, we're seeing a religious Zionist discovery, quote unquote, of the region, with, as mentioned, the withdrawal from Gaza and the West Bank leads to reflection on their position in Israeli society. Religious Zionists start looking for places to do a form of social settlement, in the sense that maybe it's not settlement in the West Bank or Gaza or anywhere else, but it's settlement that's in the periphery, that's intended for uplifting certain parts of the certain disadvantaged parts of the country. And it involves also proselytizing, but not just, okay? Also, you know, thinking about the demographic problem, bringing more kind of, you know, younger, motivated, well-educated people to the periphery of the country. Now, the Arava, you know, its significant role in the history of Israel, and at the same time its current disadvantage, fits wonderfully this idea, right? That here's a site that actually needs this social settlement and the infusion of new blood that's both younger and that's perhaps, you know, more committed to the project of bringing agriculture to the Arava. At the same time, this is quite a challenging area. So most of the settlement, the townships in the Arava do not have basic necessities for a religious Jew, like a shul, like a mikveh, like an eruv, and so on. So it's also undertaking a somewhat of a challenge by going down there. Nevertheless, in the past decade, just over a decade, religious institutions started appearing down in the Arava, including partnerships with long-term Arava residents who, as I said, are not the same demographic at all. Very much, you know, secular, left-wing, kind of Labor Party population, but have been partnering with these newcomers in order to create high school, post-high school educational frameworks, various institutions for young, you know, just discharged soldiers who want to do some civil service after their after being discharged, and also a high school that currently operates down there. With the general heading of this, right, is combining agriculture work in the Alava and the really the worst of climate and surrounding in order to infuse it with Jewish education and values. And just to give you some sense of what these are about, right? And this is from an committee on a parliamentary committee on the foreign worker problems, quote unquote, saying, well, we hope, very much hope that this sort of project will encourage ultra-Orthodox Jews and the general public to go back to working in the agriculture, as long as we did not educate the House of Israel in Hebrew labor and get them to return to work in greenhouses in 140 Fahrenheit, we'll continue to make every effort to do that, right? So very much seeing this as some sort of a redemption project. And this is one of the founders of the actual educational project. Look around and you'll see. Look at what's happening in Jordan. If we would not have been here, there would have been others living here. That is clear. We need to increase Jewish Israeli population here, which is why we established this institution in the Hebrew Labor Project. We need to draw more people here, not just local kids, but more people who connect with agriculture, with working the land. Right, and within this, there's a great deal of valuation of agriculture as also like kind of recovering values that are not found in the urban settings, and instead, connecting the young people who come there to local rural communities where real values supposedly reside. Right, so this is founder of the school. I decided to establish a school in order to connect teenagers to the values of land, leadership, mutual responsibility. So I'll spread this influence throughout Israeli society through their daily engagement in labor and in their roots. Right? And there are, and I'll let you read this. Like very much statements such as this, valuing agriculture as a way to basically renew Israeli society. This is also presented very much as something that also serves democracy, serves the Israeli state. This is Uri Bernstein, the director of one of these institutions. I believe that democracy may turn out to be ineffective if there is no common denominator beyond the mundane social and economic dynamic. When the democratic idea becomes too abstract and irrelevant to expressions of national and cultural belonging, it loses its effectiveness. Zionism has strived to create a Jewish sovereignty, and when this idea is dominant in public consciousness, it also dictates responsibility, generosity, and capacity to address diversity. All right. So now, interestingly, and I'll just mention this briefly, the local communities, who, as I said, are very much not the natural allies of the settlers, have somewhat of a grudging acceptance of this new phenomenon. On one hand, this is a very new population that's showing up, and they have also demands about having kosher food, having, as mentioned, like building mikvahs and so on, but at the same time, and this is the head of the local council is saying, this is the only population today in the country that still holds on to an ideology of settling, of bringing bloom to the desert. So we have to partner with them, right? So recognizing the kind of mutual and shared values and shared goals, despite the very, very, very different political outlooks. So, zooming out for a little bit, right? So we're seeing that religious Zionists and long-term Arava residents really converged around the attempts to revive the valuation of the Arava despite their various differences. And this very much gets back to the question of public recognition, right? We have both groups that are, believed that they used to be once very valuable, very much recognized, very much as part of the mainstream, and are suddenly finding themselves, um, devalued in one way or another. The long-term Arava residents devalued as, given the economic failure, the kind of public abandonment of, settling in the Arava as a project. The settlers, of course, by the disengagement and by their experience of basically having turned from a very central population, at least in their eyes, to a population that's very much censured, right, for being uncooperative with public programs. Now, and another thing is that the settlers are seeing this project as akin to their Gaza and West Bank settlements, right? So, even though it's not a replacement, it's not the same. It is still within the same attempt of trying to achieve public promotion, public recognition, and to promote what they believe are Zionist values. So let me just briefly conclude, and then I'd love to take your questions. All right, so overall, like across the three studies, the point is that settler public has been diverted to pursuits within the Green Line, within the Israeli recognized border. And now, of course, there are problems with these projects. Building a settlement in the Lachish region causes various environmental problems, disrupt biodiversity, and so on. Agriculture in the Arava takes extreme resources from the state, including pumping water down to the middle of the desert. But at the same time, in terms of their own experience, they are valuable in similar ways as settling in Gaza or in the West Bank. And overall, this is showing that recognition and a sense of worth are really key factors that should be considered also when thinking about how to deal with a population that is being relocated, and how to think about compensation or some sort of rehabilitation program. So thank you very much. I have the information for the two published pieces, and I look forward to the Q&A.
Thank you so much for the riveting talk, Shai. And we have a number of questions that have come in different formats, which I'm going to try and sort of bring together and to offer to you. And let me start with this, which is, it's really a question about what your research can tell us about the sort of the deeper identity of the settler movement. People have written about the settler movement as essentially a romantic movement. In other words, today, the most common perception is of this kind of right-wing sort of hyper-nationalism. And whether or not that is correct, there is this other element of certainly the early generation of the settler movement, especially those that immigrated from the United States, that have this kind of romantic back to the land, kind of almost hippie vibe. And I wonder if any of that is connected to what you're seeing in the aftermath of the withdrawal.
Absolutely. So there's a wonderful book by Gideon Aran, which unfortunately was never translated to English, but it really traces the origins of the settler movement as from the experience of the individuals who were involved with it initially. And he was an ethnographer. He actually did an ethnography there. And the interesting tension that he highlights, which I think also emerges in my work in a different way, is between between the settlers' self-perception as just destined to lead the country both religiously and civically, right, as civic leaders. Between that and their actual history of exclusion from mainstream, Jewish Israeli consideration, because when Israel was established, the ultra Orthodox were the ones who were given reign over all matters of state and religion, marriage laws, and so on. And Aran shows how the appearance of the settlements, and the 1967 acquisition of all this territory, that in their imagination is completely blank and just there for the taking. Suddenly brings in also a sense of newfound purpose and a new way to become central, to basically become the spearhead of Israeli society into this, the next frontier. And in that sense, very much kind of having a romanticized view of, just really going back to the land, both the sites, much of the biblical narrative, but also back to kind of taking the land and so on. In my work, I think it really emerges again as this tension between, we want to go and work the land and be valuable and lead the country in that regard, but at the same time also facing a great deal of rejection and kind of pushback against their idea of themselves as having that centrality. So it's very much still a living, breathing tension within at least their collective identity and their public engagement.
Right, and one of the claims that not that you make, but you show that they make in the aftermath of the disengagement was, they're saying we are the symbolic forefront of the state of Israel. We participate, we lead, we're about environmentalism, we're about the land. These are all the values of the state of Israel, which then you're showing they're just kind of continuing in a different part of the country. And I wonder, I mean, maybe it's fair to ask you as a sociologist, but I'm going to ask you, and you can feel free to tell me it's unfair, but how do we evaluate that kind of claim? I mean, the sense that we're hearing from them is that there's a degree of it's inequitable, it's unfair that the state kind of holds up all these values, which they are doing their best to fulfill, and then they get dumped on when the state looks for, has a change of direction politically. And do you find that perspective convincing, or is there some other angle that they have there?
It's a great question. I think it's unclear. In hindsight, we're all much smarter, right? And their claim, for example, that they were at the very least not stopped by past governments from settling is, there is some merit in that, right? So if they're so counter, Israeli policies, why were they, that is a legitimate question. Why were we allowed to continue to do this, / encourage, at least as the way they see it, encouraged? So there is some merit in that. At the same time, that settler population, and more generally the religious Zionist community, which is not 100% the same, but has a lot of overlap. There are lots of other things that they do lead in and can lead in. For example, frameworks for marriage and possibly divorce and kosher supervision that are not Haredi, that are not ultra Orthodox. Many education programs, many examples of military, very motivated military service. So there are other ways. All I'm saying is that there are other ways in which they can contribute and do feel like they're contributing that don't involve settling actively within the West Bank. So I'm wondering if that's something that can be also held on to and developed further in public policy in Israel.
Thanks, Shay. So I have a whole series of questions here, which are sort of more practical and specific regarding the sociology of the phenomenon you're talking about. But before I get onto them, one other question arose, which I think has very significant consequences for even way beyond the field that you've been writing about, and that's your discussion about compensation. I'm sure you're aware, people would be interested to know about Michael Sandel, the philosopher Michael Sandel's work on, what, I can't remember what the name of the book is, but What Money Can't Buy, I think the name is. And essentially the argument there is that, obviously people may want compensation for hurt that has been done to them, but the very act of putting a price on something devalues it in some kind of way. And I'm wondering what the conversations you've had with these people, the interviews, may teach us about that phenomenon more generally.
Yeah, so that emerged in the protocols of the finance committee, very much so. And we actually do, so aside from Michael Sandel's work, we also have thriving field within sociology, economic sociology, that looks exactly at those dilemmas of what's incommensurable in our lives, right? What's, what are the things that we, nothing will really set a price to. And as the debates in the finance committee showed, at the end of the day, they did, grudgingly agree to a compensation, to a very to a generous compensation, while at the same time reserving the right to remain to keep a grudge basically against that, right? Which is important because that basically means we didn't fully accept, we accepted the money for the houses that we gave up, but we didn't say that this was okay. And I think really the resentment part and the saying the story doesn't end here, and amplifying that claim is very much kind of the way to, if not circumvent, at least keep some sort of window for the future. And that's something actually you hear that in many cases. People making big claims in court about how damage was so terrible that no compensation will help, but at the same time going away with a large compensation. So I do think there is something, and there's more work needs to go into resentment as a tool that helps people also deal with situations that are really out of their control. What's better, like saying no, we're not taking compensation and being evicted.
That's so fascinating. It makes me wonder if your opening slides about what groups do to encourage solidarity and sort of thinking about themselves as morally superior and so on. But resentment as a group quality could also be interesting to look into, like you said.
Absolutely. Right.
So can I move now to, there were a number of questions that were forwarded to me that were about the local situation post the relocation. So let's start off with asking about the Bedouin. I think it was Shana who asked in the chat about Regavim and other movements that try to protect the rights and the situation of Bedouin who are living in the area. Are there any relationships between these different groups? Are there any policy consequences, legal or otherwise?
No, there's no, yes, but as a symbolic other. So basically, the Bedouin come up in many different contexts as what we want to protect from, and the fact that the Bedouins have their own plight right now, all over, both historically and currently, at least wasn't present in any of the public statements. Liron conducted numerous interviews. They only came up as what will happen to this land if we don't protect it. It is disheartening, but that is the situation. Interestingly, also, and actually, Liron has written about this extensively elsewhere. There is also a myth that the Arava was no man's land before before 1950, so before the first Jews came, that this was just empty. You know, of course it wasn't empty. I mean, there were Bedouins in the land, but I think there needs to be much more written about the erasure, basically this sort of erasure and slash fear of the Bedouin in current Israeli political discourse.
Yeah, to be sure, that's very interesting. So thanks for that insight. Um, Moving on from one other community in that area to another community in that area, people in the chat asked about, somebody mentioned a secular kibbutz in the area. I assume they were referring to Keturah, but I could be mistaken. And feel free to, whoever asked that question, I can't scroll all the way up right now, but put in the chat if you meant something different. So is there any relationship between these new settlements and other pre-existing settlements? And let me just tack on a different question in the same vein, which was, do these new relocated settlements have any kind of relationship with religious kibbutzim, which are mainly not in that part of the country, but nonetheless, is there any kind of networking there?
Yeah. So in the Alpha is primarily moshavim and not kibbutzim. And as I mentioned, they've been almost entirely privatized at this point. Nothing came up about kibbutzim that are both farther to the south and like more inland to the west, and of course the religious kibbutzim farther north. I would say, I mean, the inclusion of religious people. So rather than create new settlements, these newcomers are actually moving into existing moshavim, making gradually bringing also religious institutions like shuls, like mikvot down there. But in kibbutzim, I know that is a very lively and very contentious issue. So the relationship might be more complicated if it comes to post eviction settlers coming down to and actually wanting to join a kibbutz in the sense of getting religious services within the kibbutz, which traditionally has had none of that within its bounds.
Yeah. So somebody asked about the Gush Katif produce, and there were farms in Gush Katif that produced all kinds of things that were I'm sure sold to all kinds of different audiences, but of a special interest to some Orthodox Israelis because they used farming methods that meant there were limited or no insects in the lettuce, which is very hard to check sometimes. And you can still get Gush Katif produce. So can you say where that's coming from and what the significance is maybe of keeping that name so prominently?
I mean, the significance of keeping the name is very, if you have a brand, you want to hold on to it. I'm actually not an expert on the agricultural side of the Gaza and the Gush Katif. I would imagine, I mean, the surrounding Yeshuvim also have very, very lively agriculture. So I would imagine it's coming from there.
Thank you. And so this may also be something that is not the right question to ask, but just in case, you mentioned there was a tremendous debate and ultimately a Supreme Court case regarding the environmental impact of the relocation. And certainly there are questions about water use. And it seems like the debate is not so much of or it's at least not being presented as we care about the environment, well, we don't care about the environment, we care about something else, but rather, no, we all care about the environment, but we think the best way to pursue that value is in this direction as opposed to this direction. So has there been have there been any concrete scientific studies actually on the effect of this developments on the water table, on agriculture and that kind of thing? Who was right?
Yeah. Environmental organizations in Israel, in particular the Society for the Protection of Nature, and several others have, they have absolutely studied very carefully that specific site and have shown that the damage would be catastrophic because, or was catastrophic because it's basically connecting to several different areas that have different biodiversity, and they're allowing for biodiversity to continue and to for you migration of fauna between the various parts. About water specifically, I'm not sure if that was the most pertinent problem, but it was definitely about establishing a new infrastructure more generally, including water, establishing roads, etc., and basically tearing out the existing flora from the area. That was some of the most represented concerns in their reports.
It's always striking that issues that seem to be issues are never curtailed to one realm, like something that's in the kind of the national realm or the kind of the realm of the conflict actually ends up spilling over into all of these other areas. Quite profound. So we're coming towards the end, and I just have one, and if there's time to, but one or two final questions. At the time of the disengagement, there was genuine fear that the disengagement would result in a serious civil war among Israeli Jews. And in the immediate aftermath, it seemed that had not happened. And there's a sense, I think, now that it's all, if it's not all gone away, there's a memory of it, but the worst fears were not realized. And I wonder if your interviews give you any insight into basically, has the fallout from 2005 just dissipated, or is this still a live issue that may re-erupt in a different way down the line?
Well, I mean, we do know it has already erupted in several ways, in terms of specific parts of the settler community that have become radicalized from the West. And we're talking about things like price tag operations, basically retaliations against Palestinians who had nothing to do with the relocation. We're talking about the appearance of kind of breakaway kind of high school age kids were throwing stones, getting into big trouble, and also much more violent, right, than I think we've seen before the 2005 disengagement. It's all a part of it. Of course, there are many other factors that are contributing, but the fact that the state that you so revere, your community so revered, is suddenly saying, "Oh, actually, we're changing our mind about what you do." It absolutely leaves mark. So I think at least in that, I do think that the following withdrawal from the settlement Amona in the West Bank was much more violent than the 2005 disengagement, and this is again just after having learned the lesson once, people are responding much more violently, and this is also a population that has somewhat radicalized from the settler majority, which studies have shown and continue to show that they're actually most of the kind of laity hold much more moderate views than public perception might hold. But I think definitely that's one area in which we're seeing the violence continue in the background.
Thank you so much. So Professor Dromi, we in our remaining 30 seconds, I have just about enough time to thank you very much for the enthralling presentation and answering that very wide array of questions. Thank you so much. I encourage all the attendees to make good on the 30% discount you have on Shai's latest book, which is in the chat, which is in the chat, and just follow the link. There are many other events coming up for the Schusterman Center. Next week alone, on March the 9th, we have the continuation of our series on the lives and legacies of Aleph Dalet Gordon. And on March 11th, we have the first of a two-part series on performing disability in Israel. Our website has all of our future events, and we would dearly love to see you at any and all of them. Thank you all, and thank you, Shai.
Thank you.